I was certain that I was going to die and looked over at a blonde woman sitting next to me. We hadn't spoken the entire flight, but now we held hands as the plane fell out of the sky. People who have survived a plane crash, how did people react on the way down? I was in an almost plane crash, on a flight from Newark to Istanbul. Something didn't feel right as we were boarding, but I think because the flight next to us had just been cancelled, they got us on board and hoped for the best. Anyhow, about 1.5 hours over the Atlantic Ocean, something seems off. Then the pilot comes on saying there is a mechanical issue and they're not sure what's going on, but to prepare for a water landing. Everyone is confused and it was dead quiet. It was also nighttime, so some people were asleep. Flight attendants start wandering the aisles more and more frequently, making us more worried since we had no idea what was going on and we didn't hear from the captain. A few minutes later, the captain comes on and says there is a problem with the engine, and they're turning around and going to attempt to make it back to land. Meanwhile, the flight attendants are rushing back and forth and trying to get people to look at the safety instructions. By this point, everyone is awake, as far as I can tell. According to people I talked to afterwards, one flight attendant went and sat down and put her face in her arms. Another one apparently told someone that people don't usually survive water landings. It was just me and my mom, and the whole time I kept thinking about my little sister, and how she was going to have to grow up without a mom. It was pretty terrifying, but you would be amazed at how quiet the cabin was. After the worst turbulence I ever felt in my life, and the most silence I have ever experienced, we were able to make an emergency landing in Newfoundland. And that's the story of the first and only time I've ever been to Canada. Had a similar almost crash coming from Frankfurt to Dallas, en route home from Istanbul coincidentally, in 2004. Captain came on and says we had lost our left engine, large passenger plane with only two huge engines, and we will be forced to make an emergency landing in Iceland. Engine on the left then starts spewing fuel and oil all over the windows of the fuselage, and those of us who were awake couldn't believe our eyes. The captain then says, and I crap you not, he will be forced to land with the power of only one engine, and that he had done this in the simulator before. Once. That's the last we heard from him, and as all the passengers on the plane began to wake up, others who had been asleep tried to explain what happened. I started writing a note to my family and other people were praying out loud but generally very quiet. We made it to Iceland, had a shaky but successful landing, and that's the first and only time I've been to Iceland. One more note, that stupid Ben Stiller movie Along Came Polly was playing and will forever remind me of impending doom. I'm pretty late to this party, but here it goes. I was pretty young, only about 4 or 5, when I was in a plane crash. It was a small one-engine prop plane with just me, my dad, and the pilot who was a family friend. It was caused by engine failure. I don't remember much except my dad's actions. He was sitting in the front co-pilot seat. He reached back to me in the back seat and pulled my winter coat snug around me. It was winter in Cleveland, Ohio. Then he made sure my seatbelt was fastened securely. After making sure I was safe, he buckled himself in tightly as well. It is important to note at this point that my dad is a devout Christian. He recounted his perspective to me when I got older, and said that he was certain he was going to die. He said that he was quiet, and praying that God would allow his son to live, even if he didn't. Both my dad and the pilot were knocked unconscious on impact, and both severely injured. Dad regained consciousness first and heard me crying in the back of the plane. He told me that his first thoughts were a mix of panic and relief. He panicked, thinking the pilot was probably dead and he has to get out of the wreckage, but he has some relief because my crying meant I was alive. In the end, all three of us best the odds and survived. Not really a plane crash, but an emergency landing. I was on a Southwest flight landing in Minneapolis. First thing that tipped me off that something was wrong was when I checked my phone, and we were 20 minutes late and hadn't started our descent, nor had we received an announcement from the cockpit. There was nothing I could do, so I went back to reading my book. A few minutes later I saw something I had never seen before and hoped to never see again. The steward came running to the back of the plane where I was sitting, at full speed with a look of panic on his face. A minute later the steward announced that our flaps wouldn't extend and that we would have to make an emergency landing in Minnesota, after we burned off some fuel. While we burned off fuel, they had safety briefings for those in emergency rows. Since I was in the very back of the plane and had an aisle seat, I would be responsible for opening the right-hand door while the steward handled the left-hand door. I had time to get a signal and text my wife. Almost everyone else was doing the same. It was quiet in the plane, no one freaked out or panicked. During the landing they had us brace in crash positions. As for the landing itself, it was the smoothest landing I've ever had, The captain was a real pro and put the plane down with the lightest touch, even though he was way above his normal landing speed. On the way off the plane I saw him in the cockpit. He was soaked in sweat and you could tell he was physically and mentally exhausted. I think it was then that it sunk in for me just how much danger we really had been in. My landing made the evening news and I saw it on TV that night in my hotel room. Funny thing was, a few months later I received a letter from Southwest denying any emergency took place on that flight. Edit: many have asked me what I said to my wife. Basically I texted that I loved her and my newborn son with all my heart. I never text that kind of message, so she immediately asked what was going on. All I could reply was "can't talk, bad stuff," and I'd text her on the ground. She told me she never wants to get a text like that again. It was the longest 20 minutes of her life before I texted on the ground. Felt like less than a minute to me though. I finally get to tell this story. I was flying with a friend in northern Minnesota and had to make an emergency landing in a field. It was windy and as he was making the descent, gusty wind screwed him up and came down angled. When we came down, he cut his face on the console or stick, and was out of it. I was fine, got out of the plane, pulled my friend out, and we grabbed the go back from the storage area. Tried our cell phones, but his had a cracked screen, bad, and mine got no service. He had called on the radio before the crash and had told the emergency services guy that we were making an emergency landing. I got on the radio and called that we just crashed, and my friend was hurt badly. National Guardsmen had to come get us. I wasn't so scared when he told me that we would have to make a landing, but was nervous. I had the jitters and had my eyes on my feet the whole time. When he told me the wind was too strong, I got scared. He couldn't get the nose back up and told me to brace. I had my hands on both sides of the plane, it was tandem-style seating, and started praying. I was in a helicopter crash, everyone was silent during the ordeal, other than the pilot who was like everything is fine, crap, nope it's okay, look for the lake to ditch. We were coming down from a mountain cabin, flying by sight when fog rolled in. The pilot started swaying left and right to find something to get a bearing in the whiteout, and he found something, the trees. I will never forget going from total dizzying whiteness to cedar tree branches pressed up against the plexi wind now, the sound of chop chop chop, the smell of Christmas, smelled like fresh cut Christmas tree, I swear, and then the loudest horn ever and a big red light on the dash that said stall. I was in co-pilot seat. Somehow we managed to spot a rock by the lake, and the pilot slammed it down hard. But amazingly nobody hurt and the smoke from the engine never turned to flame. We were very lucky, and that pilot didn't fly in BC again. He flew power lines in AB after that where one doesn't have sudden whiteouts. I was in a commercial jet that fell from cruising altitude. It was a small jet flying on a now defunct airline. We had just started the descent when the plane tilted and dropped out of the sky. Nose was pointed nearly straight down. I was sitting in the aisle. People were screaming, yelling out, but I can't remember the words. All kinds of crap was flying through the cabin and the flight attendant was nowhere to be seen. My brother and dad were in the seats behind me. I remember thinking about how sad my mom was going to be, and then looking out at the window at the ground. After what seemed like an eternity, the pilot was able to regain control and the plane started to right itself again, for about 15 to 30 seconds, before starting another uncontrolled descent. It was more terrifying the second time around, the ground was far closer. I was certain that I was going to die, and looked over at a blonde woman about my age sitting next to me. We hadn't spoken the entire flight, but I reached out in some impulsive desire for human contact at the end, and we held hands as the plane fell out of the sky. I can remember looking at her face briefly, she was crying. As the ground started approaching and you could make out things like trees and houses, I felt a sense of peace fall about me. Death seemed to be certain but I didn't care. It seemed like it was going to be quick and painless, but I remember being surprised that it was going to all end this way. Then we started to feel the pilot struggling with the plane, and it started to right itself again, and for a second time the plane pulled out of the dive. It was still incredibly bumpy, and people were crying and screaming out at every round of turbulence. Everyone was waiting for the next and final dive. When we landed, the young woman and I were still holding hands. People were dead quiet. What was surreal was that the flight attendant got on the microphone when we reached the gate and thanked us for flying on that crappy airline and hoped we would fly again. They brought a bus out and one of the pilots came out with us. He didn't say a word, but his knee was shaking uncontrollably. To explicitly answer your question, some people scream and panic in those last few minutes. Others seem to accept the inevitable. In the moment it seems like there isn't much that you can do, It's all in the pilot's hands. I hate flying now. Plane didn't crash, but I sure as hell thought it was going to. I was flying back from Colorado back home to New Jersey. Plane started to descend quickly in the middle of the flight. Everyone looks around confused. Flight attendant is talking to someone on the phone PA system, then immediately sprints to her seat and buckles in. Oxygen masks drop down. More confusion, then everyone freaks out and puts the masks on. Plane is still dropping quickly. I look around to see kids are crying. I see an older couple holding hands, and a man listening to something on his headphones. Apparently there is a channel on the radio where you can listen in on the captain's radio. I listen in and hear the captain refer to all of us as 100-something souls on board. I think that was the scariest part for some reason. I'm sure it's normal to refer to people as souls, but in that context it was haunting. Ended up having to emergency land in Chicago. Never found out why the plane malfunctioned, but we all got free drinks on the next flight. I was flying to Iraq and the C-5 caught fire. Some electrical problem, and smoke started to fill the cabin. A C-5 is a huge bird, and it's also weird because you fly facing the back. So the cabin is filling with smoke and we are somewhere over the ocean. The whole time I'm thinking, we have tons of weight and war machines in the belly, and if we hit water we are sinking immediately. Some Air Force guys are walking around the cabin and tell us to reach in the pocket in front of us to grab the oxygen bags. I was expecting a yellow cup that resembled a muzzle, but I pull out a red bag with an elastic band around the neck area. I place it over my head and pull the string, then my eyes start burning like hell. As far as the reaction from us soldiers, we were in the 82nd Airborne Infantry, so we were used to jumping out of airplanes and wanted parachutes. But obviously they didn't have that many. We were all pretty calm, this being our second deployment, the first to Afghanistan no more than 2 months prior. We were all pretty much expecting death at any moment and were joking around. I think a few of the guys were playing keep away with the airbags. We ended up making an emergency landing in Spain at an Air Force base, and had to stay for 3 days while they repaired the bird. The entire time we were on lockdown because the Air Force didn't trust infantry soldiers from the 82nd. When I was in my crash last summer, no one said anything, until the pilot said something right before the wings started to hit trees. The cockpit was silent except for the sounds of the wing, the prop hitting the ground, and the crunching of sheet metal when we ended up in the trees. Upon stopping, the silence was broken when the "everyone okay?" question started. We forced the door open, got our gear out and walked back to the shack next to the runway. Pilot was very unhappy, their personal plane was totaled, but we all walked away. My buddy and I were so hopped up on adrenaline though, it was strange. I wasn't sore until the next day, and an ER visit saying low back strain was my worst result. I'll end by saying, if you can be in one and walk away from it, do it. Beats the crap out of jumping out of airplanes or being shot at. I was involved in a ground loop that we both walked away from, and the plane remained undamaged. However, it was very close to a crash with substantial damage and injury. A friend of mine took me up in a borrowed Aeroncamp, which is similar to a J-3 Cub in that it is a tube frame aircraft with fabric covering, and a tail dragger as well. Flight was totally fine and fun. However, on landing the pilot's airspeed on final was ~70 miles per hour with a right crosswind of ~10 miles per hour. We touched down at 60 miles per hour on the left main first, the right wing immediately came up pushing the left wing within inches of the pavement. This caused the airplane to make an immediate 90-degree turn where we bounded through a snowbank, and off into a field. As soon as the aircraft started to ground loop, my only thoughts were to brace for impact, covering my vital torso with my arms, thinking this is going to hurt, and I hope I do not get impaled. After making it out okay, I helped him dig the plane out of the snowbank and get it started again, and then like the idiot I am, hopped back in and went for another ride around the pattern to let him redeem himself. I am currently a student pilot, but have been flying with my parents since I was 8 days old. I wasn't in a plane crash, I was in a hot air balloon crash, not as dangerous as a plane. We spent ages up in the air, we kept trying to land at an oval or somewhere safe, but the wind picked up as we were flying, and blew us into dangerous areas where we couldn't land. The pilot, I think that's what they are still called, told us that we might run out of fuel if this keeps up and he would see what he could do to get us safely down. This continued for a while, and we ended up all crouching down in the basket, as he got the balloon as low as he could. As the fuel ran out, we ended up crashing into the top story of a house in the suburbs and scraping most of the tiles off the roof. Someone almost fell out, Luckily the house slowed us down and that street was open enough for the car that had been following us to grab the drop rope and pull or winch the balloon down safely. No one was hurt, thankfully, but scared the crap out of everyone, unsure if I'd ever go on a balloon ride ever again. I've been in 3 plane crashes, mostly on the runway. My dad has been in many more. 2 in one day, once, granted one of them he was in a helicopter. Part of the territory growing up around bush planes. The most memorable was in a de Havilland DHC-3 single-otter on floats. Happened on takeoff. The engine was spooling up and we started to work our way on step, when a massive gust of wind picked us straight up into the air about 60 to 100 feet and dropped us. Ended up landing on the left side of the plane. Everyone was a little shook up, but the real danger was that the plane was sinking now. Another guy popped the roof escape hatch and started pulling people up on top. Luckily this happened right around dinner time on a busy lake. Many boats came by to assist and nobody was injured. One guy's pants got wet and the airline's owner bought him new ones. There's not really much to say what I'd actually do with my last minutes of any given crash. It all kind of happens and is over before you know what's going on. It's a little different when you're up front, but even then unless you're actively on the controls you can't do anything. Just accept it and be ready to act when the tumbling is over. I'm probably too late for this but I'll share anyways. I was in a plane crash. We crashed while on the ground. I was 9 years old and flying as an unaccompanied minor, back in '99. So this was the first flight of the morning leaving out of a Colorado airport in December. It had snowed the night before and the roads were pretty icy. All was fine though, they de-iced the plane and we left the gate only 10 minutes later than we should have. We get into position on the runway for takeoff, and the pilot begins taking off and getting up to speed. Instead of leaving the ground however, we slide off the runway at full speed. Everyone was screaming and losing their crap. I actually followed the damn procedures outlined in that stupid manual they tell you to read and put my hands on the seat in front of me, with my head between my arms. Once we came to a stop, our wheel was dug into the ground and we were tilted, with one of the wings dug into the ground. Not really a crash but plane accident all the same. My story is an almost crash, flying back after Christmas from rural Victoria to Brisbane. The first leg was a twin-engine Beech from memory, seated about 9 people. I was young, about 15, and I was one of 2 or 3 people on the flight. The pilot let me sit up front in the co-pilot seat as I was in the Air Cadets at the time and heavy into aircraft. About halfway through the flight, I notice a few engine warning lights start to flash. Then an oil pressure alarm started going off. The pilot glanced over at the right-hand engine just as there was a bang and oil started pissing out of the engine cowling and over the wing. The pilot quickly shut the engine down as it started to smoke, says we have a small problem but it's fine. Alarms are going off everywhere, the other passengers are aware we have lost an engine, but other than that, none the wiser. But I can see what appeared to be a Christmas tree of alarms. The pilot radios in and diverts to the closest airport and calls in the need for an emergency landing. The closest airport was about 20 minutes away. I was starting to freak out a bit as the pilot fought the aircraft on one engine. As we get closer, I glance over at the pilot and see he is filling out a F-in maintenance form, strongly worded. Even at 15 I couldn't help but laugh at the situation. Fast forward to the landing, he nails the touchdown and we all get off. Pilot buys us lunch while a maintenance crew looks at the engine. Turns out it was a cheap valve or something that had failed. About 2 hours later we were cleared to fly and finish the trip, albeit quite nervous. Thanks for listening to another episode of Radio TTS. This was by far the most interesting video I have ever made. At least from my point of view. Hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you know about plane crashes. And tell me if you have been in a similar situation.